Danny Alexander has been teaching at Johnson County Community College since 1988, and he's been full time since 1993, when wonderful other people were also hired with him.
Like
His
Murray.
degrees are from Oklahoma State University, and his emphases, whatever, were on creative writing with a particular focus on music journalism. In that capacity, while he has been teaching, he's also been a staff writer for Pitch and New Times and has written at some point for just about everybody locally. The Star, New Letters, KKFI, KCUR. And for the last 3 decades, he's been an associate editor for David Marsh's rock and politics newsletter, Rock and Rap Confidential. Danny has also worked tirelessly on a lot of grassroots efforts and has worked with the national political newspaper, the People's Tribune, of which I am a subscriber, thanks to Danny,
Thank you,
as
Murray.
well as the editorial board of the political strategy paper, Rally Comrades. In terms of why he chose this particular book, we are very pleased with this book. We have a tradition of going back a couple of years of choosing books that kick off the Halloween season, as it's known in the English department. And Danny is contributing to that. And when asked why he chose this, he said that when he finished Salem's Lot, he had one of those feelings that, in his words, you can't quite articulate at the time. I knew I wanted to be a writer. I also knew more than anything in the world, I wanted to write a book like this one, and I'd always be reaching for that mark. I loved books before, and I was already writing and drawing and even making Super 8 films, but Salem's Lot lit a fire in me. So, on fire, here he is, Danny Alexander.
Thank you, Maureen. Thank you. So y'all have to bear with me. I do sort of need to read. There's a lot that I want to say, and we're going to look at different slides that show pieces of the text and some other illustrations that might be useful. Um, but I guess the wonder of Zoom is I can still look at you while I read, right? That's a good thing. So I finally decided to give this thing a title. I'm calling it Salem's Lot, Stephen King and the Need for Community. And I'll just start. And thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. In August 1976, I was scouring the bus station bookshop in my grandparents' hometown, McPherson, Kansas, trying to find something to read for my 6-hour bus ride back to Oklahoma. Since my earliest memories, sitting with my mother's Hollywood picture books open to the horror section, I was always on the lookout for something scary. I found this book that scared me just looking at it. The author, Stephen King, not particularly happy about it when he first saw it, describes it well. This is a quote from him, it was a dead black embossing of a girl's head. With her damply curling hair and her blank pupilless eyes, she looked a little like a Grecian bust. The only spot of color in the whole thing was a single drop of blood at the corner of the girl's mouth. And we have a picture of the cover here, which you can't hardly find anymore. I have one. They changed it almost immediately, but it was that complete blankness that made me so curious. The back said more, but very little. Salem's Lot. The town knew darkness, but no one dared talk about the high, sweet, evil laughter of a child and the sucking sounds. Adding a spine-tingling novel by Stephen King, author of the million-copy bestseller Carrie. Now, I'd seen Carrie around, but had no great desire to read it. It seemed like one of many other books trying to fill the wake left by The Exorcist. There was The Omen, Audrey Rose, The Other. I remember a book called Seth. They're all troubled youth with supernatural problems. At 12, I'd read some of those books as well as a bunch of Poe and H.G. Wells and Frankenstein and Dracula. A book about a teenage spoonbender, Carrie, didn't seem very scary. This paperback jacket promised something different. King tells the story of the cover art to explain that he was disappointed his name wasn't on the front cover, just as it hadn't been on the cover of Carrie. As we all know, he made up for that in the future. But art director James Plumeri, who did that cover at New American Library, he sold me the book. This all-black cover with the mysterious embossment had the allure of a forbidden text. It even felt right, with this soft-edge paper that seductively had me strumming it in the store in every step of the way as I began to read. After those 6 hours on that bus, I was hooked. I read slow, not wanting to miss one detail or nuance. I would reread paragraphs before I could move forward. I've rarely felt such pure pleasure, and I wanted it to last. When I think of the moment I fell in love with literature, it was those hours reading that book. I want to say that I became a writer reading that book. Meanwhile, Stephen King became Stephen King. He's called Salem's Lot his coming out party. Carrie had been a big enough book that by the paperback release, when it sold 1.3 million copies, he gave up his teaching job. Salem's Lot sold 1 million more paperbacks, and coupled with news of Brian De Palma directing the Carrie movie, his next book, and then Stanley Kubrick doing The Shining. The Shining was destined to be King's first book on the New York Times bestseller list. The Rave called him the undisputed master of the modern horror story. Just 3 years later, on a Halloween episode of Dick Cavett that I remember vividly watching in my mother's front room, the TV host would introduce King alongside writers Peter Straub, who scared me to death with a book called Julia, at around the same time, and Ira Levin, who'd written The Stepford Wives and Boys from Brazil and what am I forgetting? Rosemary's Baby, right? As well as the guy who thought up the modern zombie. I mean, today we take it for granted that zombies are some sort of virus that eat brains, they eat brains, you know, but that was director George Romero that came up with that, as far as I know. But Cavett singled out Stephen King, almost seemed to embarrass him, calling him the biggest selling author in the world. By this time, King had 4 more hits with his name prominently featured on the cover: the short story collection Night Shift, The Stand, Dead Zone, and Firestarter. The Stand and Firestarter, though dealing with very different themes than Salem's Lot, shared many of its standout characteristics and helped originate a genre of horror fantasy that is prevalent today. Among the ideas I want to outline are the distinct characteristics of that horror that descends from King. One piece of why King's horror was different is that it's some sort of a reaction to the cultural explosion of the post-World War II baby boom, particularly its counterculture. King's horror carried and carries to this day some of the promise of that era, and in 1975, when Salem's Lot was published, it makes sense as something America needed in the wake of the destruction of that countercultural moment, or at least the seeming destruction of it. The dissolution of the civil rights movement, the bitter, painful cynicism of the Vietnam War, and for some, the hollow victory of the Watergate hearings. The 70s was calling itself the me decade, poised to focus on more narrowly circumscribed and cynical visions of possibility. King met us in that cynical, beat-down state and offered something different. Key to hooking the reader at that time are the multiple book openings. The initial point of view is objective, almost like a story by the young Hemingway, traumatized by what's gone before, cynical and resigned in his expectations. It's like an effaced narrator at first that grows into something else. It describes a man and a boy people assume to be a father and son moving from place to place in the American Southwest and then into Mexico. They are fleeing something the book won't name, something terrible. After the boy confesses to a priest in a Mexican village, we come to realize they will have to return to face the threat again. And if you can go ahead and put up the first reading, I'll read that. And you just listen to these voices as they shift or morph and grow. A week later, he awoke sweating from a nightmare and called out the boy's name. "I'm going back," he said. The boy paled beneath his tan. "Can you come with me?" the man asked. "Do you love me?" "Yes, God, yes." The boy began to weep and the tall man held him. Still, there was no sleep for him. Faces lurked in the shadows, swirling up at him like faces obscured in snow. And when the wind blew an overhanging tree limb against the roof, he jumped. Jerusalem's Lot. He closed his eyes and put his arm across them, and it all began to come back. He could almost see the glass paperweight, the kind that will make a tiny blizzard when you shake it. Salem's Lot. So then the book jumps back a year to establish the point of view of the unnamed man. He's a writer named Benjamin Mears, returning to his childhood home to put to rest the ghosts of his past. Other prominent point of view characters are also introduced, including his love interest, Susan Norton. Reaching back to what I think of as the classical elements of modernism, King begins the story of his town with two overt nods to Thornton Wilder's Our Town. First, an omniscient narrator gives us an overview of the town, its history, its geography, and its dying culture. And on this second reading, I can't help but feel, I'm the stage manager, right? If you know Our Town. What Salem's Lot knew, and I'm just reading little bits of all these things to give you a sense of the flavor, and I want you to look at the words and get a sense of the flavor as it changes. But anyway, so now I'm the stage manager, right? What Salem's Lot knew of wars and burnings and crises in government, it got mostly from Walter Cronkite on TV. Oh, the Potter boy got killed in Vietnam, and Claude Bowie's son came back with a mechanical foot, stepped on a landmine. But he got a job with the post office, helping Kenny Danley's, and so that was all right. The kids were wearing their hair longer and not combing it neatly like their fathers, but nobody really noticed anymore. When they threw the dress code out at the Consolidated High School, Aggie Corliss wrote a letter to the Cumberland Ledger, but Aggie had been writing to the Ledger every week for years, mostly about the evils of liquor and the wonder of accepting Jesus Christ into your heart as your personal savior. Some of the kids took dope. Horace Kilboy's boy, Frank, went up before Judge Hooker in August and got fined $50. The judge agreed to let him pay the fine with profits from his paper route. But alcohol was a bigger problem. Lots of kids hung out at Dell's since the liquor age went down to 18. They went rip-assing home as if they wanted to resurface the road with rubber. And every now and then someone would get killed, like when Billy Smith ran into a tree on the Deep Cut Road at 90 and killed both himself and his girlfriend, Laverne Dubé. But except for these things, the Lot's knowledge of the country's torment was academic. Time went on a different schedule there. Nothing too nasty could happen in such a nice little town. Not there. So. Then, like Wilder's milkman, stopping at the Gibbs and the Webbs at the beginning of Our Town, Jerusalem's Lot's Win Purinton brings the milk to the boarding house where Ben is staying and to Susan's home as well. Like Wilder, King is using the quaint to heighten our sense of familiarity. But he is complicating it, playfully showing that nothing is quite as it seems. The stereotypically cheery milkman is mentally complaining about Susan Norton ordering a sour cream. We know it's for the dinner her new suitor Ben will have at her house. Purinton is, and this is like thoughts in his head, his internal monologue, he's thinking, it was going to be one of those days when everyone wanted something special, sour cream. He had tasted it once and liked to puke. While he's stewing over trivialities, we're about 6 pages from learning that he's complaining about nothing compared to the hurt waiting for him when he gets home. The book's first victim is the milkman's dog, Doc, already dead when his owner makes his rounds. The book concerns itself with many dangers: schoolyard bullies, town gossips, abusive husbands and overprotective mothers, and many secrets: furtive love, alcoholism, shady business dealings. There's a really sleazy realtor who gives the town over to the monster, and a lurid whispered history before its central dark secret becomes clear. And so then there's this shift. The stage manager takes a different tone with this third reading. I assume that's up. The town knew about darkness. And this is a long section. I'm just picking a little bit out of here. The town knew about darkness. It knew about the darkness that comes on the land when rotation hides the land from the sun, and about the darkness of the human soul. The town is an accumulation of 3 parts, which in sum are greater than the sections. The town is the people who live there, the buildings which they have erected to den or do business in, and it is the land. The people are Scotch, English, and French. There are others, of course, a smattering, like a fistful of pepper thrown in a pot of salt, but not many. This melting pot never melted very much. The buildings are nearly all constructed of honest wood. Many of the older houses are salt boxes, and most of the stores are false fronted, although no one could have said why. People know there's nothing behind those facades, just as most of them know that Loretta Starcher wears falsies. She's the librarian. The land is granite bodied and covered with a thin, easily ruptured skin of topsoil. Farming it is a thankless, sweaty, miserable, crazy business. The harrow turns up great chunks of the granite underlayer and breaks on them. In May, you take your truck out as soon as the ground is dry enough to support it, and you and your boys fill it up with rocks perhaps a dozen times before harrowing and dump them in the great weed-choked pile where they have been dumped since 1955 when you first took this tiger by the balls. And when you have picked them until the dirt won't come out from under your nails, when you wash and your fingers feel huge and numb and oddly large pored, you hitch your harrow to your tractor, and before you've broken 2 rows, you bust one of the blades on a rock you missed. And putting on a new blade, getting your oldest boy to hold up the hitch so you can get at it, the first mosquito of the new season buzzes bloodthirstily past your ear with that eye-watering hum that always makes you think that it's the sound that loonies must hear before they kill all their kids, or close their eyes on the interstate and put the gas pedal to the floor, or tighten their toe on the trigger of the 30-30 just jammed into their quackers. And then your boy's sweat-slicked fingers slip and one of the other round harrow blades scraped skin from your arm, and looking around in that kind of despairing, heartless flicker of time when it seemed you could just give it all over and take up drinking or go down to the bank that holds your mortgage and declare bankruptcy. At that moment of hating the land, the soft suck of gravity that holds you to it, you also love it and understand how it knows darkness and has always known it. So at this point in the story, we do know the town we are reading about no longer exists at the point the novel begins. It's a ghost town, and there's strange happenings around it, which we'll come back to later. The Man in the Desert has already read us a newspaper clipping giving us a backstory that touches on a wide variety of fears and popular mythology in the psyche of 1970s America. Everyone in the town has disappeared, and a puzzled newspaper reporter suggests many causes. The relatively new federal highway system, corrupt business practices, he's not far off there, colored lights and rumors of UFOs, the fear of a dark coven led by young people engaged in black mass, perhaps a criminal mass murder. Half of the book plays with this variety of fears. It only gradually reveals that it is not a story about teenage Satan worshipers, which in some ways underscored by that cover, that ambiguous black cover, or space aliens, or even the tale of the bad place also considered in that newspaper article, an idea that would fully evolve in The Shining. In a sense, Salem's Lot starts like a ghost story. People are looking for a fresh start. The author, Ben Mears, who has come back to his childhood home to write a book, his girlfriend, Susan Norton, who wants to leave and work as an artist in New York City, but now has some new considerations having fallen for this visiting writer, and a 12-year-old boy who knows neither of them yet, Mark Petrie, the new kid in town. The ghost story archetype typically looks like this, and I'm a teacher obsessed with ghost story archetypes. People try to start a new life but wind up isolated. Their new home features things that go bump in the night and threaten to steal their dreams for the future. In the end, they have to face the sometimes literal skeletons knocking to get out of the closet. They have to deal with the past if they hope to move forward. Ben and Mark at least realize their new home has things that go bump in the night, and Susan finds her new love is awakening such fears in her. But Salem's Lot is only a ghost story in the archetypal sense. It offers a threat that is both more tangible and fantastic than any ghost. Halfway through the book, although the hints have been accumulating before, this mystery reveals itself to be a vampire tale. The local English teacher who's read Dracula, teaches Dracula, and it's seen enough horror movies to put the pieces together, figures it out. In 1975, vampires benefit from a new contradiction. Everyone in the book knows about vampires as the stuff of comic books and Hollywood fantasy. Certainly not anything that could happen in the real world. King started Salem's Lot before his success with Carrie convinced him he could become a full-time writer. At Hamden Academy, a 170-year-old high school, originally a theological seminary, like many of our original schools, just south of Bangor, King taught both of the book's obvious antecedents, Our Town and Dracula. And the book idea came straight out of that experience. King's told it many times. He loved teaching Dracula and found himself wondering aloud at dinner what would happen if the Count turned up in 1970s America. King joked that Dracula would probably get hit by a cab, and it, quote, like Margaret Mitchell in Atlanta. Or the FBI would show up and drag him off. I thought it was funny. I was watching Blackula last night, and he actually is hit by a cab early on in the movie, which is struck me as funny. The two other authors at his table, his childhood friend Chris Chesley, who is one of those boys from Stand By Me, like the real kids from the story The Body that he grew up with, and his wife Tabitha. They disagreed with him. Chesley said, "You haven't been through Cumberland County lately," and Tabitha said, "Or Eddington." King writes, "I began to see their point. There are so many small towns which remain so isolated that almost anything could happen there." And King knew those towns. He grew up in them. And King had a sense of audience that he credits with his mother's insatiable reading and all the storytelling he did among his friends growing up in those small towns. Like William Peter Blatt, he must have known with The Exorcist, coaxing a 1970s audience into believing in possession, or in this case, vampires, and a Dracula character to boot requires a thoughtful strategy that would make it seem like a new discovery. The first clue that this is a version of Dracula is fairly early, about page 140, when two laborers, Hank Peters and Royal Snow, have to deliver a giant sideboard to the town's legendarily haunted Marston House. In 1975, they could easily call to mind the two fishermen in Peter Benchley's 1974 Jaws, who almost got eaten by a shark dumping a roast off a boat dock. But once the reader realizes this is a vampire tale, they may as well be Jack Smollett and Thomas Snelling, who deliver great boxes to London's Carfax Abbey and Dracula. Stoker's delivery men tell protagonist Jonathan Harker, who knows all too well what is in one of those boxes, that the house was, quote, neglected that you might have smelled old Jerusalem in it. Me and my mate, we thought we would never get out quick enough. From those lines likely come not only the name of the fictional town, but almost certainly one of Salem's Lot's scariest early set pieces. Hank Peters and Royal Snow cannot explain the fear that comes over them as they carry this large box into the cellar under the Marston house. But after several tense pages, they get out okay, only to find they forgot to put padlocks on the doors, part of their instructions, and leave the key ring on a table in the cellar. Hank makes the trip. So that's what this fourth reading is. He forced his legs to carry him down the steps, and when he had cleared the roof overhang, he shone his light across the visible cellar, which took an L turn 30 feet further up and went off God knew where. The flashlight beam picked out the table with a dusty check tablecloth on it. A rat sat on the table, a huge one, and it did not move when the beam of light struck it. It sat up on its plump haunches and almost seemed to grin. He walked past the box toward the table. Hist, rat. The rat jumped down and trotted off toward the elbow bend further up. Hank's hand was trembling now, and the flashlight beam slipped jerkily from place to place. Now picking out a dusty barrel, now a decades-old bureau that had been loaded down there, now a stack of old papers. Now he jerked the flashlight beam back toward the newspapers and sucked in breath as light fell on something to the left side of them. A shirt? Was that a shirt? Bundled up like an old rag? Something behind it that might have been blue jeans? And something that looked like something snapped behind him. He panicked, threw the key wildly on the table, and turned away, shambling into a run. As he passed the box, he saw what made the noise. One of the aluminum bands had let go and now pointed jaggedly toward the low roof like a finger. He stumbled up the stairs, slammed the bulkhead behind him. His whole body crawled into goose flesh he would not be aware of until later, snapped the lock on the catch, and ran to the cab of the truck. He was breathing in small whistling gasps like a hurt dog. He dimly heard Royal asking him what had happened, what was going on down there, and then he threw the truck into drive and screamed out, roaring around the corner of the house on two wheels, digging at the soft earth. He did not slow down until the truck was back on the Brooks Road, speeding toward Lawrence Crockett's office in town. And then he began to shake so badly he was afraid he would have to pull over. What was down there? Royal asked. What did you see? Nothing, Hank Peters said, and the word came out in sections divided by his clicking teeth. I didn't see nothing, and I never want to see it again. Aside from its correlation to Bram Stoker's Dracula, Salem's Lot also has a personal feel that calls to mind the first great horror novel, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Just as readers can see Shelley's character as both the monster and the monster's victims, Justine and Elizabeth, Salem's Lot arguably has three versions of the author as core characters in the story. There's the modestly successful, serious writer King might have become in Ben Mears. I have serious writer in quotes for myself here. On his fourth novel, King had written that many unpublished, serious social problem novels too, which later got released, most of them as Bachman books, Richard Bachman. And then there is the secondary school English teacher who King portrays in realistic terms, not particularly heroic, but earnest and appealing to some students for this reason. Matt Burke, almost 40 years King's senior, is also a teacher with several decades of experience. He's one path King's life might have taken, notably an admirable but resigned teacher working in a flawed system. The first vampire recognized as such is Mike Ryerson, one of Matt's former students who, working as a gravedigger, is overtaken by the first boy killed by the town monster. Matt meets his old student in a bar, and understanding that he is sick and confused takes him home, all the while putting the pieces together. The resulting encounter causes Matt to have a heart attack, although he doesn't die right away. He becomes, over the course of the book, as he characterizes himself, the Mycroft Holmes of the story. Anyone else reading this, and several of the core characters, recognize Dracula's erudite vampire hunter Van Helsing. The third incarnation of King in the book is, like I was when I was reading it, going on 12, Mark Petrie. He is like King and so many other young people of that era, a student of the classic horror movie fanzine Famous Monsters of Filmland. I meant to grab one. I have a stack somewhere, which started publishing when King was 11 and was still going strong in 1975. He builds Aurora's Universal Monster movie models in his bedroom. And I wanted to show you this picture of these models. There's a couple of pictures here Alexa's going to show you. You know, I mean, some kids were putting together, you know, helicopters and airplanes and all sorts of things that make sense, but some kids like me and Mark in the book were putting together monsters. They had these glow-in-the-dark parts, which on some of them, or you could not have them, and you could paint over those or not. And King touches on that in the book. So it's like he knows me, right, as I'm reading it. He is second only to Burke in his understanding of the threat. Mark is. And as is clear at the end of this unforgettable scene when the boy first encounters a vampire at his window, King believes that the child is better equipped to deal with such things than his adult counterparts. So we have this fifth reading, and the fifth reading comes after a famous scary scene with the vampire at the window that anyone who's read the book, this is what you remember. And Mark's father comes down the hall and says that he heard something and he's checking on him, and the boy tells him he's just driven off this vampire with a toy cross from one of his models. But he tells his dad, no, it's nothing's wrong. And then there's this piece of the reading here. The door shut softly and his father's slippered feet descended the stairs. Mark let himself go limp with relief and delayed reaction. An adult might have had hysterics at this point, as a slightly younger or older child might have also done. But Mark felt the terror slip from him in almost imperceptible degrees. and the sensation reminded him of letting the wind dry you after you'd been swimming on a cool day. And as the terror left, drowsiness began to come in its place. Before drifting away entirely, he found himself reflecting, not for the first time, on the peculiarity of adults. They took laxatives, liquor, or sleeping pills to drive away their terrors so that sleep would come. And their terrors were so tame and domestic: the job, the money, what the teacher will think if I can't get Jenny nicer clothes. Does my wife still love me? Who are my friends? They were pallid compared to the fears every child lies cheek and jowl with in his dark bed, with no one to confess to in hope of perfect understanding but another child. There is no group therapy or psychiatry or community social services for the child who must cope with the thing under the bed or in the cellar every night, the thing which leers and capers and threatens just beyond the point where vision will reach. The same lonely battle must be fought night after night, and the only cure is the eventual ossification of the imaginary faculties, and this is called adulthood. In some shorter, simpler mental shorthand, these thoughts passed through his brain. The night before, Matt Burke had faced such a dark thing and had been stricken by a heart seizure brought on by fright. Tonight, Mark Petrie had faced one, and 10 minutes later lay in the lap asleep. Plastic cross still grasped loosely in his right hand like a child's rattle. Such is the difference between men and boys. You know, there's a lot of reasons I chose to talk about this book, but one is something imprinted in me real early on, and it led to my first real sort of activist work as a writer, which was writing about censorship. And because everything I had ever loved was, you know, almost, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but I tended to love things that were supposed to be bad for you. And King seemed to get that, and captures it in scene after scene throughout the book and elsewhere. So now in that scene, as others have earlier in the book, Mark's cross lit up. At the very beginning of the book, the first time something lights up like this, it's called an elvish light. If David Davis is out there, knows what an elvish light is, in reaction to the vampire. Those familiar with Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, and who isn't these days, will make a connection to the Frodo Baggins sword Sting, which glows blue when the goblins of Middle-earth, the orcs, are near. In King's second introduction to Salem's Lot, 20 years after its first release, he talks about reading The Lord of the Rings, probably not long after it debuted on the New York Times bestseller list in 1966. What the 19-year-old King saw in that book was an expanded version of the Dracula story, which he'd read at about 10 or 11, like me, with Sauron as the Count, Gandalf as Van Helsing, and Frodo as Jonathan Harker. This is important because one of the things the preteen King loved most about Dracula was the band of heroes brought together to fight the monster. This fellowship, thrown into common cause because of some unexpected threat, became an archetype repeated in one King novel after another, from The Stand to It, to the Mr. Mercedes series, Dr. Sleep, and yes, even his most recent novel, he's had If It Bleeds, a compilation of stories, but The Institute was the last novel. This fellowship was dubbed the Ka-Tet, K-A-T-E-T, in King's own great fantasy series, The Dark Tower. And it has become a central archetype of the modern horror genre, linking everything from Buffy the Vampire Slayer to The Walking Dead to Stranger Things. In Salem's Lot, the new family born out of the annihilation of the old is Matt Burke, the English teacher, Ben Mears, the author, Jimmy Cody, the Youngtown doctor, Susan Norton, an artist, Father Callahan, the Catholic priest, and Mark Petrie, a little boy who loves monsters. The tale takes a toll on this cast of characters, though they all fight valiantly. The priest, ironically, or maybe not ironically, has the hardest time with this whole thing. Only Ben and Mark survive this Ka-Tet's battles, so they serve as the man and boy who framed the book. That adult and child bound together against impossible odds resonated with me as a child. I was living in a post-nuclear family, just me and my dad, and it echoes through King's novels one after another. It's everywhere, particularly in the fantasy novels, but notably in a certain kind of horror story King helped create. And I'm focusing here on the intergenerational thing, you know. It's there in The Shining's famous mother and son fighting side by side with the cook Dick Halloran, which many of us remember from Kubrick's movie as Scatman Crothers. I think it was Melvin Van Peebles later. It's there in The Grown Man and Young Girl of Firestarter and the mother and son of Cujo. It's there in the quartet of his collaborations with Peter Straub, The Talisman and The Black House. The It Losers Club, which everyone knows now, the assortment of addicted townspeople in needful things, the variety of stranded travelers in desperation, the neighbors caught in the shared nightmare of the regulators, all those decent people connected by a women's shelter in Rose Matter, the colorful small town police department from a Buick 8, the quintet of telepathic friends in Dreamcatcher, the surly retired detective, a teenage neighbor boy's family, and the autistic sister of the retired detective's great love in Mr. Mercedes. A horror series disguised as detective novels for about one book. And the extraordinary assortment of weaponized children and their would-be saviors in last year's The Institute. It's quartet, an older couple, a younger couple, and a group of teenage boys and girls. In fact, not finding other people facing the darkness alone perhaps provides the greatest horror in each of his books, as it certainly does in an extended 3 a.m. montage through the lot after vampires have been taken over the night. And this is also just a very small excerpt of sort of what I find a beautiful passage about 3 a.m. Town Constable Parkins Gillespie shambled from his office desk to the coffee pot looking like a very thin ape that had been sick with a wasting illness. Behind him, a game of solitaire was laid out like a clock. He had heard several screams in the night, the strange jagged beating of a horn on the air, and once running feet. He had not gone out to investigate any of these things. His lined and socketed face was haunted by the things he thought were going on out there. He was wearing a cross, a St. Christopher's medal, and a peace sign around his neck. He didn't know exactly why he had put them on, but they comforted him. He was thinking that if he could get through this night, he would go far away tomorrow and leave his badge on the shelf by his keyring. Mabel Wirtz was sitting at her kitchen table, a cold cup of coffee in front of her. She's a town gossip that reminds me of she reminds me of the character from Edith Wharton that sort of meddles in everybody's affairs. The Age of Innocence, right? The shades are pulled down for the first time in years, the lens cap on her binoculars. For the first time in 60 years, she did not want to see things or hear them. The night was rife with the deadly gossip she did not want to listen to. There were others in the town who were either sleeping or waking untouched. Most of the untouched were single people without relatives or close friends in town. Many of them were unaware that anything had been happening. Those that were awake, however, had turned on all their lights, and a person driving through town, and several cars did pass, headed for Portland or points south, might have been struck by the small village, so much like the others along the way, with its odd salting of fully lit dwellings in the very graveyard of morning. The passerby might have slowed to look for a fire or an accident, and seeing neither, speeded up and dismissed it from mind. Here is the peculiar thing. None of those awake in Jerusalem's lot knew the truth. A handful might have suspected, but even their suspicions were as vague and unformed as 3-month fetuses. Yet they had gone unhesitatingly to bureau drawers, attic boxes, or bedroom jewel collections to find whatever religious hex symbols they might possess. They did this without thinking, the way a man driving a long distance alone will sing without knowing he sings. They walked slowly from room to room as if their bodies had become glassy and fragile. And they turned on all the lights, and they did not look out their windows. That above all else, they did not look out their windows. In the recent movie, It, Chapter 2, a common complaint about King turns into a running joke. At one point, voiced by a cameo role King, when he's talking to the author protagonist in the story, he says, I didn't like the ending. Readers often identify King with disappointing endings. Although I know where it comes from, It's final clown turned spider wasn't exactly a people pleaser. Such complaints must come from people who don't read much horror, a genre notorious for glorious failures in the last act. King, however, should really be recognized for the unusual care he takes with the characters at the end of almost every one of his novels. I could rarely stop reading any of his books in the last 100 pages because 60 of those were so cathartic and so careful and so satisfying because he took each character and he sort of put them in their proper place at the end of the story. He closed out the experience as if he cared about everyone you'd read about. He does that in Salem's Lot. Salem's Lot works so well in part because he learns how to make the ending both realistically tough and compassionately hopeful. King himself declares the story took a turn he didn't expect, and he seems to recognize its importance to his career. King explains, I like the idea of my vampire novel serving as a balance for Stoker's, which has to go down in history as the most optimistic, scary novel of all time, placing faith in modern ingenuity to keep the old world at bay. When I sat down to write my version of the story, a version whose life force was drawn from the nervously jokey Jewish American mythos of E.C.'s William Gaines and Al Feldstein, it was drawn more from them than from Romanian folktales. And what he's talking about there are these E.C. comics that were banned. Once again, something that was assumed to be dangerous to youth in the 1950s. They were one of the first things blamed for juvenile delinquency, pieces of pop art, along with rock and roll. And you know, I grew up with a comics code that protected you from you know, told you it was censored and you could read it. Anyway, he saw his book as half Dracula, half EC. I saw a different world, one where all of the gadgets Stoker must have regarded with such hopeful wonder had begun to seem sinister and downright dangerous. Mine was the world that had begun to choke on its own effluent, that had hooked itself through the bag on diminishing energy resources and had to deal not only with nuclear weapons, but nuclear proliferation. When he sat down to write, he assumed the vampires would win. In one intro, he writes, and more power to him. However, the story surprised the writer. In that same late 90s intro that I've quoted from a few times here, he goes on to explain, some of my human characters turned out to be stronger than I'd expected. It took a certain amount of courage to allow them to grow toward each other as they wanted to do. But I found that courage. If I have ever won a single battle as a novelist, that was probably it. Writers have found it so much easier to imagine doom in the years since World War II, and especially in the years since Vietnam. Easier to imagine characters that grow smaller as a result of their trials, rather than bigger. Ben Mears, I discovered, wanted to be big, wanted, in fact, to be a hero. I let him be what he wanted to be. I've never been sorry. The heroism doesn't come easy. When it gets down to Ben and Mark alone, they almost give up. They have to fight to keep each other in the game. They have to tell each other that they love each other. Ben, the man, has to tell Mark, the boy, that he can't do it without him. Together, they do go back to Jerusalem's Lot to face the demons that almost killed them. The book doesn't end with the final stake driven into the final vampire, but it ends with a fighting chance. And this is the last reading. They walk up, Ben and Mark come back to this town that's a ghost town, but they know that there's been all this roaming around and there's been like sheep being killed in nearby farms and people disappearing. They walk up over this hill, to this hill over the town behind the, there's a house, the Marston House, that's kind of like the overlook in The Shining. It overlooks the whole town. That's where they're standing in this field when this final speech is read. The old timers say this is where it started, Ben said, back in 1951. The wind was blowing from the west. They think maybe a guy got careless with a cigarette. One little cigarette. It took off across the marshes and no one could stop it. He took a package of Pall Malls from his pocket, looked at the emblem thoughtfully. In hoc signo vinces. And I know it's like Winques in Latin or whatever, but this is Pall Malls, right? And he tore the cellophane top off. He lit one and shook out the match. The cigarette tasted surprisingly good, although he had not smoked in months. They have their places, he said, but they could lose them. A lot of them could be killed or destroyed. That's a better world, but not all of them. You understand? Yes, Mark said. They're not very bright. If they lose their hiding places, they'll hide badly the second time. A couple of people just looking in obvious places could do well. Maybe it could be finished in Salem's Lot by the time the first snow flew. Maybe it would never be finished. No guarantee one way or the other. But without something to drive them out, to upset them, there would be no chance at all. Yes, it would be ugly and dangerous. I know that. But they say fire purifies, Ben said reflectively. Purification should count for something, don't you think? Yes, Mark said again. Ben stood up. We ought to go back. He flicked the smoldering cigarette into a pile of dead brush and old brittle leaves. The white ribbon of smoke rose thinly against the green background of junipers for 2 or 3 feet, and then was pulled apart by the wind. 20 feet away, downwind, was a large jumbled deadfall. They watched the smoke, transfixed, fascinated. It thickened. A tongue of flame appeared. A small popping noise issued from the pile of dead brush as twigs caught. Tonight, they won't be running sheep or visiting farms, Ben said softly. Tonight, they'll be on the run. And tomorrow, you and me, Mark said, and closed his fist. His face was no longer pale. Bright color glowed there. His eyes flashed. They went back to the road and drove away. In the small clearing overlooking the power lines, the fire in the brush began to burn more strongly, urged by the autumn wind that blew from the west. And then, as King always does, he puts the dates. He wrote the novel at the end, 72 to 75. So they're doing all they know how to do, and they might just succeed if the wind turns a little their way. You don't know. It's a kind of ambiguous maturity that closes some of my favorite stories. I mean, the ending of Salem's Lot makes me think of Anton Chekhov's The Lady with the Little Dog, where you have this couple in an impossible situation, and the cathartic, the redemptive thing at the end is that they sit down and they think that there must be some way out of it. Or James Baldwin's Sonny's Blues, where you have a brother that finally gets a glimpse of who his little brother is, and neither one of them's out of the woods in any way, but they have this moment, of hope and a sense of direction. The struggle isn't over by any measure, but there is hope in the moment. Whatever real monsters and demons have hounded our trails over the course of the past 4.5 decades, King has been there by so many of our sides, offering us surrogate fears as a means to understanding alongside an increasingly expansive vision of compassion and even hope. I, as just one of millions, can't thank him enough. And that's my talk. I would love it if any of you had any questions and we could talk a little bit about it. It'd be great. There you are. I was looking at a script, so yeah, it's good to see you.
If anyone has any questions, we can unmute you. Beth, do you have a question? Let's see. You can also use the chat.
Hi. Macy Branch here. So I read Salem's Lot in the 8th grade. It was very formative. I read Carrie first, though, so I had that experience. So the vampire mythology is like this very rich thing, and American literature was kind of like a counter to that. You had Richard Matheson doing I Am Legend, which is like doing everything it can to break vampire rules. And Salem's Lot does a really good job of creating a world where all of those rules apply. I don't know. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
I think it's it certainly sets itself down squarely to be sort of classically embrace the mythology, right? And to you know, I think that that's I think the surprising and sort of wonderful thing about it is that you don't expect that. You know, you don't expect in 1975 someone to actually tell Dracula straight, but like tell it in you know in the moment.
Allergic to garlic and everything. Like,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they're always they all like know the rules from like Hammer movies and stuff. They're always like, well, I've seen enough Hammer films to know this, or, and they speculate about the garlic. You know, the doctor thinks it's maybe an allergy or something vampires have, right? You know, but yeah, I think he wanted to just do it straight head on. You know, I mean, I don't know if that's I don't know if that addresses your question in any way, but it seems that he wanted to celebrate that mythology and play with how that mythology would play out in the modern world. Um, is that a useful answer, or
yeah,
is that?
that's useful. I don't know. I was just throwing something out there. No one was saying anything.
Yeah, no, that's good. I'm actually curious what David Davis would say to that. Do you want to say anything or not? No? David knows so much about
On your
vampires.
show, Danny.
Mike Jackson has talked about in the chat. He brings up the idea that he wonders if King was ever tempted to come back and change the endings, like the ending of Tommyknockers.
Yeah, or take out the spider. You know, from the way that I understand that he liked the movie ending to it, not having the spiders. Because some of the books, like Tommyknockers, I read, I love most of King's work, but at the ending, it was like, man, you know, you really could have spent a little more time with that. Easy for
Yeah,
me to-
well, I think it was, you know, the 80s is when, you know, man had written sort of 4 or 5 stunning openers, right? Is you can tell he's struggling a little bit with how to move forward, and I've sometimes thought that like from the 90s on, he almost might be called magic realist as much as a horror writer. You know, you know, he's not always working, you know, squarely in the genre. But you know, I don't know how many. I don't know much about, you know, what he's said about changing endings. I haven't heard much in that way. But the one that comes to mind is that he was tickled to death by the new Pet Sematary, because he'd never liked the ending to Pet Sematary, and which I don't know how many people do. And it's actually far worse than the original. It's so much more horrible what happens, but it's like delightfully so that it's sort of like, you know, you find yourself laughing at how awful it is at the end, which is kind of what that story needs in a way. I mean, in another sort of way, it's like there's just a new community formed, a very dark community formed at the end of it. But I think, you know, I think a lot of the knocks on King come from the 80s, this period, and there were lots of things going on. I mean, you know, I don't want to overplay any of this. Not everybody, but lots of people struggle with substance abuse problems and that sort of thing. But he talks about not remembering writing some of those books, you know, and that's in that period in the 80s, you know, before he really has a strong turnaround at the end of the decade and into the 90s. I think some of his best books are in the 90s. You know, and certainly, as much as I love Salem's Lot, I would say I love the last 20 years of his career far more than the first 20. You know, there's certain books I love there, but yeah. So that's, I don't know if that's helpful, Mike. I'm, you know, is that okay? All right, good. Thank you. It's good to see you. Always good to see you. Anyone else?
I'm Jim Likert, whose discussion of Frankenstein, right, is available on our Great Books archive. Also brought up something on the prevalence of children. You want to address that, Jim?
Right. Well, yeah, I've read about 20 of his books, and I had to get through most of them before I realized how so many of his stories have children, or at least adolescents, as the protagonist. The Shining, It, Christine, and I don't know too many other writers who go out of their way to make kids the front and center of it. And it also makes me wonder how much of this is autobiographical. I heard when King was about 10 years old, his dad went out for a pack of smokes and never came back.
Yeah,
And
maybe earlier. Yeah.
yeah, maybe earlier. And that certainly leaves some childhood trauma, I would suppose. That I wonder if he's trying to work some of that out through all of these stories.
Well, I think that's, all the portraits you get of King's childhood are pretty grim. They apparently, I've heard this. I don't know if Sam Bell's still around, but the Wonder Years was originally like conceived as like being made about David and Stephen King and that family, but it was so grim and so dark they scrapped that idea. Went with a different family, but or a different concept of idea. But I certainly think, I mean, on writing, he returns to his childhood again and again, and he floated from home to home. Ben is the most autobiographical character I can imagine almost from him, is Ben's childhood. He doesn't have a stable home. He lived in Salem's Lot for just a few years with his aunt, who's now dead. And King loved his mother, but his mother, he, describes as not always being there and either, but she did foster in him a certain love of reading. For me, it always ties back to that. Someone asked him when he was here speaking at Unity, they asked him, have you ever thought about writing a young adult novel? And he said, oh, I thought that's what I did. but the thing is, and that's what because he certainly hit me that way, he does it without a trace of condescension, right? The kids, first of all, he's writing things in there that your parents aren't going to approve of, lots of things, and but he feels just like that, just like Mark Petrie in the book, like the kids can take it, if they've gotten this far in the book, they're okay, and so I think he always thinks of kids as part of the audience in a way, almost always. And I get that. And, there's something of not to go on and on, but we have culture so subdivided and age appropriate and so specific to different groups today. I think another thing King carries forward in a lot of ways for me is that sense of culture that we once had that was pretty much a shared culture. There might be a cultural war between older people and younger people or something, but people saw the same movies, they read the same books, he's speaking to several generations at once, like intentionally, I think, just like the characters represent them. I hope that's a good answer, Jim. I don't know, others? I probably do have good answers. Keep going.
Hey, Danny. I've always loved Stephen King as a short story writer. What do you think of the short stories he wrote that kind of frame Salem's Lot? He wrote Jerusalem's Lot as a prequel, and then there's another one I forget the name of, about what happens a few years later.
Yeah. In fact, I think that I think in Salem's Lot that story's hinted at. The one where the family disappears driving through Salem's Lot, right? And that's like in the in-between year, maybe the in-between year. Well, they're both beautiful stories. The first one seems like a Lovecraftian thing, right? I mean, it seems that the one that's set back in time.
It's almost an homage to Lovecraft, yeah.
Yeah, which was a huge early influence on him, as you know. And well, I read the novels first before I read a lot of the short stories, and my friend David here always said that he preferred the short stories, and I've gone back and read all of them in the past few years, and found that I think I don't know if I prefer them, but they're wonderful, right? And I think those stories are great. I think it's interesting that he has the freedom there to create a completely different story. I think in that original Salem's Lot, it seems like it does suggest the bad place, doesn't it? It sort of suggests it's not the same thing that happens, but something like that is going to happen there whenever, right? And yeah, I think those stories are just as dark and scary as Salem's Lot in their own way, you know. So is that helpful? Yeah.
Okay. Well, we have finished the hour. I think Danny is willing to hang around if other people would like to talk, but I'm just going to put a plug in. This spring, Danny is teaching literature of American literature of American music. And I think, Dave, are you doing the fantasy intro to fiction?
I am. Intro to fiction, focus on fantasy.
Okay. In addition to that, we've got more great presentations coming up. In November, on the 11th, we will be hearing from Beth Gully on Nikki Giovanni's Acolytes, which is our first collection of poetry that we've done for Great Books. So we are definitely looking forward to that. And in the spring, we will be hearing about Waiting for Godot and Anansi Boys and one other that might be Rachel Carson. We're not sure. But keep looking for those. Okay. So thank you very much for coming and for being our guinea pigs for this first ever Zoom Great Books.
Yes.
Danny,
you so much.
Thank you, Danny.
Well, thank you all so much.
The only thing we're missing is the applause.
Well, thank you. I'm very honored you all came and put up with me. So, all right. Take care. All right.